Hey, what's going on, folks? Welcome back to the Graphic Design is Fun podcast. My name's Dan. Today we are chatting with Emunah Winer, brand designer and co founder of the branding agency Nihilo. Emunah is honestly one of my favorite designers working today. I was really stoked when she said that she would be down to chat for the podcast. One thing I wanted to mention here right off the bat with Emunah's new agency, Nihilo, they released this deck. It's a Google Slides document that outlines their branding process in so much detail. It's extremely in depth and it includes a bunch of examples. Genuinely an awesome resource if you are a graphic designer who is into branding or wants to get more into branding. This thing is massive and definitely might give you some ideas. I certainly I went through the whole thing and definitely took a lot away from it. So yeah, I recommend checking it out. It's really cool that this is just something that they are releasing just out to the public for free. Um, it's an awesome resource. So yeah, make sure to check that out, and as well as all the other um, links that will be in the show notes for all the things that we mentioned throughout the episode. And yeah, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Emunah Winer.
I hope you don't mind. I'm drinking a coffee.
Yeah, that's fine. You're drinking a coffee at 10 p.m.?
I am. Yeah, it's not ideal, but that's the stage of life that I'm at right now.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I have way too many coffees, and at this point, they don't really affect me anymore. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
So is it like are you still doing more work tonight? That's why you're drinking a coffee, or it's just like
No,
okay.
I kind of like have this. No, this is my wind down activity, but I've kind of like come to. I don't really go into it. It's this routine, right? Like I don't go into a meeting without a coffee. So
Okay.
it just works out that way. It's kind of the way like I pump myself up for every meeting.
Interesting. No matter what
Sometimes there's
time of
not.
day.
Yeah.
Dang. I could never do that. That would send me out of control and I would never be able to
Yeah.
sleep.
It's better that way. It's not particularly healthy.
True, true.
Yeah.
Um okay, cool. Well, wait, actually first of all, so it's pronounced how do you pronounce your last name?
Oh, very good question. Emunah Winer.
Okay, Emunah Winer. And
There you go.
I've heard people mispronounce the name of your agency for sure, which is just Nilo, right?
Yes, good
Yeah.
for you. Nobody gets that.
Well, I think I heard you say it somewhere and I was like, okay, I'm not going to screw that one up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like this silent HI. We thought about that when we were naming it, but then we are like, you know what? The way people mispronounce it isn't that bad either. Nihilo, like we can roll with it. So we went with it anyways.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. Well, let's start at the beginning, I guess. What's your kind of background or how you got into design? Yeah, let's just start at the beginning.
Sure. Okay, that's a deep question. So in high school, let's go way back. I got into fine arts and I started studying fine arts and I applied to fine art colleges. And I was going to go to Pratt Institute. That was my like kind of direction of choice. I had a brief sabbatical in Israel. That's a thing like a lot of Jewish people do. So I was here and then I ended up staying here and I deferred and then I ended up just kind of staying here. And here's where I got into graphic design. I ended up going to an accelerated sort of program here. And that's where I was like, okay, cool. This is a thing I could do and I'm good at. And I realized at that time that I don't really have a lot of patience for fine arts. So this requires a lot less patience. Even when I recently started picking up painting again, just like as a mental exercise. And I still don't have the patience. But anyway, so I got my degree in graphic design. At that point, I moved to Columbus, Ohio. I actually had my first job, not in graphic design exactly, but in like production design. So it was really a lot of fun, like making storefront displays for retail environments, which was actually great. Like I was building things on the floor with my hands, and then they got produced at mass scale.
Oh, cool.
I have a lot of appreciation for that job. What happened after that?
Wait,
After
so
that,
sorry. I'm just
yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious about that. So you would design like a storefront, what it would look like, and then that would be reproduced and like put throughout like all the different locations of a store?
Kind of. So we were based in Columbus, Ohio, is a huge company called Limited Brands, and they own like Victoria's Secret, Bath and Body Works, Pink, and a number of other ones. So I worked for a company that was essentially a production vendor of limited brands. And we would work with Bath and Body Works and Victoria's Secret and Pink. Those were like our primary customers to build like the in-store displays. And storefront displays and actual storefronts. Like if you look at any Bath and Body Works store, like their exterior facade is like this gingham plaid pattern. So I was
You made
at my
that?
I didn't originate the pattern, but I iterated on it. Like you've no idea how detailed it gets, and based on the printing methods and the material we used. So like we used double hits of white ink to both sides of polycarbonate panels that would then be put up against glass. It was fascinating, actually.
Wow.
The majority of my work was for Bath and Body Works. But it was super cool.
Yeah,
Like
that
I
sounds like actually like a fun job that you would never think of because like who thinks of like the
does
people who
that.
designed like
Yeah.
storefronts? But yeah, that does sound fun. But was that like a backup job? Like you wanted to go into graphic design because that's what you studied?
So okay, so I went into graphic design. I was doing kind of like freelance work, and then the owner of this production company offered me, I started off there like on the floor, like in the finishing department. So I wouldn't be nothing on the computer. I would literally be sitting there with like an X-Acto knife, like cutting things out.
Right.
Um, yeah, that was like tough, laborsome work. And then eventually I like kind of piped up and I was like, hey, I actually know how to do this stuff. I studied graphic design, and then they moved me up. And then I got to like be kind of designing and strategizing and thinking about printing and production methods. I don't really know how I got there. Like I was still kind of doing freelance, like, you know, common like design stuff on the side, but that was my job. That was my day job. And I was there for like 3 years, and I really enjoyed it. And the company was great. The company is called Digico Imaging. Really solid people, really encouraging environment to grow and like kind of grow into a higher leadership position. And I was really actually sad to leave that job. The only reason I left is because we decided to move to Israel. So at that point, I was married, and we were like, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And we came here, and then the first job I had here was actually at an agency. I was like, throughout that time, I was practicing my design. I knew I was kind of good at it and wanted to keep doing it. I just didn't know exactly how it would work into my career, my day job, I guess. But here I landed a job at an agency, and then I kind of went up the ranks there and eventually became a design director. It was a small agency that no longer exists, but it was really eye-opening to me. My first experience with like larger clients, and that's where I at the point that I left, I was very clear and determined that I was focusing like exclusively on brand design. I sort of saw what happened when you try to do everything. So I knew I did not want to do that.
Right.
And yeah, so then I left. I was independent for a couple of years, and then my current partner of Nihilo, we met there at that agency.
Right.
We were both kind of working independently, and then we realized like we should be working together and making this a thing, and that's what we did. But no like huge agency experience, none of that, like none of the fancy stuff, to be honest.
Hmm. But the agency that you did work at, when you left there, you had enough sort of experience and confidence to be like, I can sort of
Yeah,
go
I
on my
was like,
own.
I was running their design department, and
Right.
it was just like kind of a big mess in and around it. So I was like, I'm just gonna go and do this by myself. And at that point, I was getting freelance inquiries. I kind of had, I don't really know when or how, but I was just like, I've always been a learner within like the industry I'm interested in. So I would just constantly be, like looking at everybody else's work basically and kind of understanding how to get this done and putting the pieces together without necessarily having the experience of being taught those pieces. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, and actually, I was thinking I was going to ask you like because looking through some of your older work and your work now, like actually, I'll just say this, and I don't even know if I'll keep this in the podcast, but I love your work so much. You're like one of my favorite designers that I follow, and
Oh, thank
I'm
you so much.
always just like super inspired by your stuff, and I don't even know what it is. It's just yeah, it's just like everything just clicks, and it's like sophisticated without being like overly complicated. Do you feel like you have like learned a lot over the past couple years or through your career, and like how have you learned and sort of gotten to the level that you're at now?
First of all, thank you. That's really, really kind of you to say. There's this quote by Ira Glass. I don't know. Do you know who Ira Glass is?
No, not really. I know the name, but I
Okay,
actually it's
that's
like a
okay.
is she a first of all, is it a
It's
man or a woman? I don't even
it's a
know.
man. It's a man. He's the host, producer, founder of a podcast called This American Life.
Okay, okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And he was really one of like the first kind of podcasts like ages ago already. But I one time saw a quote from him, which is like so great for all creatives. And he said, like, there's this point in the beginning of your career that nobody talks about. And it's that anybody going into a creative field, you go into it because you have an incredibly high taste level and you're able to recognize like these high level of craft. And but what nobody tells you is you're going to go and you're going to start out and your own work is not going to reach those levels, and it's going to be like incredibly frustrating, and it takes like literally just time of practice over and over and over again before your work, your output ends up reaching the level of craft that you appreciate.
Right.
So it was like, for me, I always knew what the goal was. I to some degree, it's this kind of like, I don't want to call it taste because that sounds snobby, but like the ability to recognize good work, I always had that ability. So I always knew what I was leveling myself up against. It was just a matter of like practice over and over and over again until I got there. And I shouldn't put that in the past tense because I've certainly gotten to some places, but there are many, many places I want to go and have not yet been able to achieve in the construct of the way I'm working right now. But so yeah, so it was two things. Like having that goalpost set really high and knowing what I was trying to achieve, whether or not I could get there was like my own frustration, but like knowing what it should be and knowing what, like, not pretending my work was good when it wasn't good, and creating made up projects to make the good work when I didn't have the projects, because I knew what good was. And I was like, if my client work is not going to let me do this yet, I'll make it up. And that's what I did. And that's actually how I got, and I'm sure you like hear that all the time, but like, that's how I got my first site up. Like, I think like 2 out of the 5 of the projects up there were, I'm like, I can't launch a website with just like 2 or 3 projects. So I just made up 2 other ones, which looked great. And it did showcase my ability. And then, we're also in like the customer service business. So my output of my work is like directly tied to the relationship with the client. And that's something people talk about less, but like you really have to be able to be a kind, empathetic person in order to get the best creative results.
For sure.
So, and I see that like when the synergy with my clients is greater, the work is greater. And when it's less and we're not understanding each other, like there's just no way we can't get around it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, I think it's and also trying to steer clear of trends as much as you can, and editing yourself is difficult to do, but necessary.
And editing yourself?
Yeah, like restraint. I think sometimes the best, like what we try to do in our work is always distill it down to like a singular concept. And it's tempting to just do a bunch of other cool things, but just to utilize restraint and say, like, pocket that's a good idea for the next project, but we need to be incredibly, extremely committed to the singular idea and not veer away from it. So, and that comes down to practical guidelines too, and the way you hand over the project to clients, and like creating very clear systems and rules. I love systems. I'm a big systems person when I can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like becomes a science, and it just
Yeah.
starts to make sense at a certain point.
Yeah, and I think that's actually yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is definitely something that comes through in your work, is that like there's one idea that we're saying like, okay, this is what we're focusing on, and everything else sort of has to be eliminated because it just distracts from like the main kind of
Yeah,
focus or like main message. And then like how that actually translates into like all the things that end up being made, it's just sort of like staying on track and not letting random or unnecessary like elements kind of like creep in just because they're cool, or just because sort of um just because it's just tempting when you come up with a good idea.
exactly. And save those good ideas, because like they'll come into play in a different project, but you have to be patient.
Right. Yeah, because it's tempting to be like, okay, well, this is my chance, this is cool, let's do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, just save them for later. That's good advice. But on the topic of constraints, and maybe this is a little different, but maybe not. Like the project you did for Olami, that's a project I really liked because there was this constraint. Like for people listening who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm maybe getting all the details wrong, but
Oh,
something along the lines of like they have all these schools, and the kind of brand had to be made in such a way that like people who are non-designers could use the sort of elements and make things, posters or whatever it was. And like part of that was like it needed to be, people needed to just use Canva, people who are not graphic designers, and actually like take the like elements that you made and do things with it, which to me seems like a constraint that so many designers would be like, oh god, this is like a project from hell. Why do I have to tailor my work to people who are gonna be using Canva, who don't know
sabotage it.
anything about graphic design? But that project is so great, and it's like you just took that constraint and we're like, okay, well, we have to work within this. And yeah, it just made for such great, beautiful work. And I think part of that like actually is the constraint, almost as like a good
Yeah,
thing.
100%. Like we may not have necessarily landed on it if that wasn't the constraint. And
Right.
like it's every once in a while we do get the project where it's like you have full creative reign, do whatever you want. And we actually find those projects a lot more difficult, because it's like, well, you can do this and you can do that. And before you know, you're trying to like stuff everything into one thing. And really it just ends up being like a collage of all the cool ideas you've had in the back of your head, but with no reason or purpose or audience in mind. And like, so yeah, you're absolutely right. And then like, of course with Olami, we had this was just like a beautiful moment when we realized that the logo itself had the circle, which then played
Yeah.
into the rest of the system. And then it's kind of like once you break that like understanding, then it's almost like the restraints create the possibilities, because once you're within the realm of like, okay, you can do anything. And like you can go, it's kind of like raising kids. Like which I don't think you have experience with yet, I assume.
No.
I have 3 kids, but it's like you set the rules up and you set the guardrails, and then within that they feel safe to explore and to grow and to think outside the box and everything. But you kind of need those in order to make sure that people aren't falling, or brands aren't falling off the edge.
Right.
So yeah, and I mean with Olami in particular, they were also very helpful in that their in-house team, we built like hundreds of templates out in Canva to be reflective of the system. And that was not me doing all of that, thank God. It was me in collaboration with their in-house team. And then then they're kind of flying with it. Obviously, there's always a gap that needs to be reached between the brand guidelines and how the client executes it. And it's a growing process and it takes time. But there's something there for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think and that's always a challenge I feel like that you see even from like really big agencies where you can create these beautiful brand guidelines and everything is very detailed. And then you're like, let me see how this actually looks in practice. And you like go on the company website or
Yeah.
their social media and you're like, oh, this completely fell apart. This
Yeah,
they did not
exactly.
really adhere to the guidelines. And I think that that's something that you do really well is like being realistic in terms of like what the client can actually achieve and creating guidelines, not because the guidelines are going to be really sexy and it's just like satisfying to make as a designer, but like we actually need to take into consideration what is going to work. And yeah, I think that that's an important thing as a designer to remember. Is just like it's not all, well, yeah, it's definitely not all just like you having fun and making things that are like cool and sexy and everything like works beautifully on the guidelines if it's
Yeah.
just going to fall apart in real life.
Yeah. And you kind of have to find the things you love beyond the like just making cool shit. Like you have to find the problems you like to solve and like the um systems you like to create and what like fuels you in that way. And there are kind of venues of graphic design for the people who like really just want to make cool stuff and like go make band posters or
Right.
like, but I don't think branding, well, I guess it also depends which companies you are branding. There are also the agencies who are only branding the fun companies, but they've worked years and years and years to get there and they didn't start there. Um, yeah, like I'm thinking of one agency in particular called Day Job out of, I think, California. And they
Mm.
just do like the most ridiculous brands ever. And that's become their thing. But I'm sure you don't start there by doing that. You start there by
Right.
like building trust with your clients and your audience in a non-gross marketing sort of way.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I find myself throwing that caveat in after lots of
Yeah,
sentences as well, but like
exactly.
not in like a gross like content marketing way, of course.
Right. Not in a gross, like I'm a new thought leader sort of way.
Yeah.
Do not
um,
call me a thought leader.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so speaking of branding, I wanted to ask about your partner at your agency, Margaret, and
Yes.
her role doing verbal brand identity. Um, just because I think a lot of graphic designers will get into branding and sort of brand or like brand identity equals visual identity, and it's kind of
Yeah.
the same thing. When there's more to it maybe than just the visuals. What does she do as a verbal identity designer? I don't know if that's quite the right
Sure.
term, but
Sure. So I'll tell you kind of like how we came to like the realizations we came to. So when we were working independently, and I'm sure a lot of freelancers can relate to this, but we basically every single time saw our work then piecemeal together with other mediums. So you take my visual design and then you'd get a copywriter and then you might get like a video person for the promotional website and a photographer for lifestyle photography. And before you know it, like this isn't one brand. This is 5 brands made from 5 different people. I just maybe happen to play the visual part. So it might be the most front and center, but it's not the same brand. And then from Margie's side, she was a writer and she is a writer and a strategist and actually comes from a poetry and literature background. So we're both very, very craft driven, but like the main principle behind our work is a brand is not a visual brand or a verbal brand. It's actually just the means in which a company communicates itself. So for all we know, that could be exercised through many different mediums. Maybe it's through motion, maybe it's through sound, maybe if it's a product, then it's the way it feels and how you hold it and how it sounds and how it speaks and the words it uses. So actually all of these things are a brand. It happens to be the things that we bring to the table primarily at this point of our agency is visual and verbal. Eventually our dream is to extend that beyond that. Like, let's see, what if we had a motion specialist on board from the beginning of the branding process and the entire brand became identified with motion? Or what if we had a sound designer? So that's kind of the way we like to approach mediums in general. I know the design world likes to see like visual identity as core, and people always ask like, oh, can I just have a logo and some colors and a typeface? And that's the easiest parts to understand. So we don't see it that way, and we are trying to work with clients that also don't see it that way. And it also gives us the opportunity to kind of work with clients that need a more strategic lens and find themselves having problems of like, how do we communicate? How do we say literally with words what we want to say? So we're dealing with clients like that, and then we get to utilize other opportunities through words that we can't do through pictures. So our roles in the company are like 100% equal, 50-50. We both are kind of equally crazy, obsessive creatives and like obsessed with our work, to probably an unhealthy degree. So we both have very similar visions of what we want to do and the type of work we want to create. And yeah, obviously the workload shifts. We're very small at this point. We work with like additional people on a per project basis, but really it's us two. So the workload will shift throughout the project. But yeah, we're both kind of in our heads in every project from the get-go, and then figuring out, is this something we want to express verbally? How do we balance that visually, or vice versa? Yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but
No, that made perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you were saying about how a brand can turn into five brands made sort of from five different people. Yeah, I mean that's something that you see all the time, and like the difference between for example, like having your own sort of in-house motion guy who's like part of the team and is going to work on it from the beginning, versus you create all this stuff and then you hand it off, and then later down the line someone comes along and it's like, yeah, it's just not speaking the same
yeah.
language that it was
And it's so
intended to.
nuanced too. They'll be like, but what do you mean? Like, it's our colors and it's our fonts. So of course it's the same brand. And it's very hard to explain unless unless there's really that creative direction from the top level, that's being spread through every medium. And that really means through every person on the project.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about, sort of speaking about your guys' process at Nihilo, the huge deck, PowerPoint, or
Yeah.
Google slide. I don't even know. I mean, what to call it. Your whole process laid out, super in depth. That's just this public presentation that anyone can go look at. What's sort of the story behind why you guys made that, and why you decided to share it? Which I imagine some people might be
Sure.
like, "Oh, that's crazy! You're giving away all your sort of secrets."
Sure. That's a funny story. So, okay. So first of all, we had just started our agency and we were kind of racking our brains of like, how do we need to get things done on paper? We need to understand our own process so that when we're working with a new client, just to like systemize processes, like we don't want to have to make up this process every single time we're talking to a new client. Like, what do we do? How do we do it? And I think we all go through that. And the catalyst that actually made us put it down on paper is, and I'll just be like completely transparent here. I don't know if you're familiar with the company called AFI or AUFI. It's an acronym for Ask Us for Ideas, and they're like a company out of the UK that's sort of like a matchmaker between companies, and they say between companies and the top 1% of agencies. So they're pairing companies up, companies come to them and they pair them up with agencies. And it's, again, a very difficult, that's a difficult challenge to nail in like a non-gross, salesy, sleazy way. And they've really done it. So the real reason we put that deck together in full transparency is because we had a meeting with them, and with every new agency they on board, they like asked for like a little presentation, and we went completely overboard because at that point we're like, we really like this thing, like this is cool, let's keep building it. So we built it, and then they saw it and they're like, this is cool, and we're like, this is cool. And then it was time for our newsletter, and we didn't really have anything to share. And I've been like, I've used other agencies, kind of like open resources, as a huge resource for me. There's like a old, now closed down agency in New York called Harraf. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but they just disclosed, like opened up their entire Google Drive once, and that's a Google Drive, not just a slide deck.
Wow.
And I was like, this is so cool. And really, I looked at the deck and I'm like, there's nothing here that anybody can take that, like, we obviously disclose, like we covered up any real proprietary information with clients, and we're like, everybody could figure this out. This isn't the what makes us like do our work. Our work is us, essentially. So we weren't really worried about people stealing any proprietary information. We more were like, this is a really freaking cool deck, and I wish more people could see it. And that's what we did. And then we put it in our newsletter, and then it kind of just blew up, and we weren't expecting that at all. We kind of didn't really have anything to put in our newsletter, and we put it in there, and we thought like a couple hundred people will look at it. It ended up being a lot more than that. And I'm happy we did, because we did get some messages after that it really helped people. And what's going to happen? Like, somebody's going to take our process and get our clients. Like, that's not how this works, you know? And frankly, like, for every threat of somebody taking our process, we just got like some good press.
Right.
So that's how these things, just share, just be open. Like, the more you show, the more eyes you have on you. So yeah, we really felt like we had nothing to lose, and I'm happy it helped some people.
Yeah, I mean, it helped me. I went through the whole thing and I was like, wow, let's soak this in. This is crazy.
Cool. I'm
And
so happy to hear that.
yeah, and I definitely took a lot away from it. But actually, yeah, as you said, sort of as a bonus, like just good sort of free promo, it's kind of the best kind of promo, because it shows that you guys are honest, and also like have a very in-depth process where you might like it's easy to go to agencies or to see an agency and have no idea what they actually do. You just see the end result. So it's kind of probably very reassuring to be like, oh, this is the whole process laid out for us as well, you know?
Yeah. And to be honest, I think our process it's always evolving and iterating, and it's definitely not the same way it is in that deck, but it is something. We have a slightly shorter version of that because it's very intense, that we sometimes show to clients, and we like, this is totally how we break down every single project. And you're absolutely right. It's really reassuring to them. I mean, it's never going to be the exact same thing, but like, they're like, okay, there's nuance in here, and there's flexibility, and we're covering this, we're covering that, and it's all covered, all going to be taken care of. It's very reassuring. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's I think that's all I got for you.
Cool. Thank you so much. This was a lovely chat.
Oh, really? I'm glad.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode of the Graphic Design is Fun podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find the show, so it would be very much appreciated. If you have any feedback, any suggestions, or just want to say hello, you can shoot me a message at Dan Allen Studio on Instagram or Twitter. If you love the podcast, if you hate the podcast, whatever you got, I would love to hear it. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.